Hi there, I'm Scott Lowe with Actual Tech Media, and thank you for watching this Discovery Series video. I'm joined again today by Joe Mercis, who is the CEO of Cloud Daddy. Joe, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So we're going to talk about security and data protection, and really those are two sides of the same coin today. You know, it used to be a day when you had a data protection person, you had a security person, and they may have been part of a risk management organization, but they weren't necessarily aligning with each other very well. Today, that's all changed. Security and data protection go hand in hand. What are your thoughts on this merging and melding of security and data protection and what that really means for people?
That's a great question, and we have to back up the clock like 10 years or even 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, you didn't really have the prevalence of a chief information security officer within an organization. 10 years ago, things started to kick into play where you literally needed a chief information security officer. And these days, organizations and enterprises wouldn't be caught dead without having a chief information security officer. And, you know, I think everyone understands the reasoning for that in terms of the progression of technology and the security risks involved with technology today in comparison to even a decade ago. So if we look at the prior data center model in the past, everyone was responsible for their own data centers in the past. 10 years ago, you didn't have Amazon Web Services. You didn't have Microsoft Azure. What you had was organizations, enterprises being responsible for their own premises-based hardware, software applications. They did everything from rack and stack and installing, configuring, you know, and they had to get the funding in order to rack, stack, configure, and blow out these data centers, right? Today, you have a totally different scenario. You have cloud-based services that are hyperscale. They can grow dramatically like that. You have a need, doesn't make a difference how big it is. You can find a cloud services provider that can provide it today, right now. So what we're seeing is a mass adoption of cloud-based services, and specifically, infrastructure as a service. So many organizations / enterprises are looking at their costs from a CapEx and OpEx perspective, and they're looking at the fact that if they were going to build it out themselves and host it locally within prem and continue supporting it and maintaining it and moving forward, it's extremely costly. So most organizations and enterprises are looking at, hey, instead of building it on-premise within our data center, let's take it and put it up in the cloud instead. So what we're winding up seeing now are many enterprises that are basically hybrid. You know, they've got a data center, but it's much smaller than what it used to be. Right. And they've got a presence up in a cloud, be it Microsoft Azure, Google Compute, Amazon Web Services, and the infrastructure as a service side to the equation is just skyrocketing because more and more organizations are realizing the benefits of moving to the cloud and putting their data up in the cloud.
But along with those benefits are coming some new challenges. So whereas we have really well-defined products to deal with things like data security and the on-premises infrastructure, to protect ourselves in the cloud, a lot of people don't realize is they still need to do data protection. If you go to Office 365, the assumption is that it becomes someone else's problem, when nothing could be further from the truth. Mm-hmm. And that goes for Amazon Web Services and the other providers as well. There needs to be some additional work that's done to, one, protect yourself against potential for disaster, because not all disasters are natural. There's human disasters too. I mean, that's a horrible title to have as a job, the human disaster. But there's also the need to maintain some level of security around this stuff that people don't always think about. So what are some of the new challenges that organizations are facing as they move workloads into the cloud, and what can they do to help address some of those challenges?
You're absolutely right. And if you look at what's happening in terms of the cloud adoption, all enterprises and organizations are realizing that the same types of concerns that they had on premise in terms of, hey, you need to install the updates, you need to patch, hey, they just released security patches or updates, you need to roll them out as soon as possible, potentially have a little bit of a UAT, user acceptance test of a patch installed within an environment, and then, hey, everything looks good, and you roll it out immediately. That same type of scenario still applies regardless of whether you have a hybrid environment. So you're installing those patches and updates locally on your premise, and you also have to do the same thing on your cloud-based environment. And if you have any policy concerns in terms of your servers that are on-prem, those same policy concerns apply to the cloud as well. So if ports should be locked down, for example, specific security groups should be in place. All those kinds of scenarios exist on-prem and regardless of whether you go to the cloud. And this is why the necessity for a chief information security officer is so important in today's day and age, because we know about the maliciousness that is occurring from an internet-based perspective.
Right.
And the fact that you can become infected like that depending on where one of your users go. And the internet is a pretty malicious place depending on where you go these days. And even good sites have been hacked where, you can have a drive-by type of download. So unexpectedly, you could be one of these poor users that goes to a website, didn't click on anything, but has gotten infected, And then depending on your job, you may have to go to malicious websites. For example, attorneys, depending on what kind of cases they're working on, it could be a child abuse case, what have you, they may have to go to specific areas that are pretty bad on the web in order to prove what's happened within a case. And at that point, you could become infected. So a chief information security officer would basically wrap his arms around that type of a scenario, ensuring that, hey, we need to be protected in terms of wherever somebody goes and whatever somebody does, it doesn't come through and infect our entire network,
Yeah, and there's lots of different approaches to what we're seeing, a response to that today. It used to be where the firewall was the end-all be-all. That was what organizations said. We put a firewall in, our security woes are over. Today, it's recognized as a first line of defense, the firewall. And we're starting to see a need to do things like microsegmentation and make sure that when not an if, but a when people actually get through, what are they going to be able to do? What are some of the really guiding principles we have to think about when it comes to security and potential for a breach? I mean, I know one is like limiting an attacker's access once they get in. What are some of the things organizations can be thinking about protecting themselves in the case that they do get breached?
Some of the things that organizations can do to protect themselves is, number one, having a very tight policy in terms of installing patches, updates, security updates specifically, etc. In addition to that, they need to review the policies and settings within their server base in ensuring that specific ports are locked down. For example, there's a port used by a specific piece of ransomware that's a 1664, I believe it is. And port 1664, you have it open, guess what? You could be a victim of a specific piece of ransomware. And we talked previously in regards to, the fact that anybody, some 16-year-old or 13-year-old can go up on the web and download code and understand how to write malicious viruses or malware or even ransomware these days. But even worse, we've got very deep NSA code that's also been released on the internet. So this type of knowledge is up for grabs for anybody who's got a couple $100 and wants to, freshen up their programming skills and be able to understand how this kind of stuff is being propagated across the internet, right? So, the CISO definitely, the Chief Information Security Officer definitely plays a part in terms of ensuring everything's done right. But then even then, it's almost impossible, depending on your data center footprint, to have all of your servers patched and updated at the same time, because it requires downtime, oftentimes, and the other side of it is you don't want to be installing patches during normal business hours because it could have a business impact, and you're concerned about maintaining business continuity, so things are being done at night at the same time that you're running backup to prevent any kind of business, discontinuity or breakage as an end result of installing updates, patches, or even running backups. And you can potentially have bandwidth issues too. So coming full circle, in today's day and age, the security side of the equation is extremely important, and it's one of the 3 top factors, in my opinion, that most CIOs are dealing with today in ensuring that backup or disaster recovery and data protection, ultimately in conjunction with security and management of their infrastructure, is all tied together.
Right. So one of the things you mentioned before was a CISO is not necessarily the end-all be-all as well. Like a firewall, they're the first line of defense, and they're human. So humans make mistakes, and humans don't scale well. So we're starting to see the emergence of things like artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us try to identify those anomalous patterns that can detect when something is going the way we don't expect it to be going, and it could potentially be a footprint or a fingerprint for an attack. Cloud Daddy has done some work in this, and I believe you have a patent that's been pending around some of this. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So firewalls are only as good as their configurations. And what we've seen over the last 5 or so years is the emergence of what's called an intelligent firewall. So, you used to have firewalls that were just based on configurations. Okay, I'm going to block this port, I'm going to open that port, so forth and so on. And now you've got intelligent firewalls that are literally looking at packet data and making distinctions as to whether it's good or not, and potentially taking an action on it, right? But that's still not enough. You've still got data that's coming in and out, and you need to establish rules that govern the flow of data. And looking at the way things are established today in terms of a data center and the security that needs to be in place, this goes hand in hand with backup and disaster recovery, because we know of many scenarios whereby an enterprise backs up their data to a appliance that is all flash-based. So it's not, tape media, it's flash memory, for example, within an appliance. Could be 100 terabytes, and they're backing up their virtual machines there, and everything's golden until they get hit with a piece of ransomware that literally is spread and hit that appliance as well and encrypted it. Right. Now, how do you prevent that from happening? And this leads to the fact that Cloud Daddy understood what was happening out there in the world and decided to come forward with a patent. And we do have a U.S. patent pending in terms of artificial intelligence and machine learning applied to making a distinction based on anomaly that we perceive. And anomaly can be based on CPU utilization, memory utilization, bandwidth, etc. We notice an anomaly after establishing a baseline for the data, and then we take action. And the action could be where we quarantine existing backups in addition to isolating that specific instance or volume, and locking things down further, sending alerts to administrators to take action and take a look. But we won't knock out your system, obviously. We'll take protective actions in terms of preventing any kind of additional maliciousness or propagation.
Right. So one of the things, as you were talking, it reminds me of monitoring tools of old, where you'd put this monitoring tool in, and within an hour you'd have 72,000 alerts in your inbox, and it was utterly useless. So one of the challenges I could see with something that is trying to automate the understanding of things based on resource utilization is if a CPU spikes because somebody's running a query, that's different than if a CPU spikes because someone is attacking your system. There's an associated resource correlation you have to deal with. And so can you talk about how your solution addresses some of those kinds of challenges?
Sure, and this is an interesting type of a scenario because you're right. You can be running a SQL query on a Windows machine, for example, and have the CPU spike. So obviously, we're not going to trigger anything in cases like those, because what we do is we establish a baseline with a machine to begin with, and then understand whether there's a variance, an anomaly that needs to either be investigated and the machine locked down in terms of a specific port that may be getting utilized that we're aware of, could potentially have maliciousness activity over it, and that kind of a scenario. So that's where the secret sauce comes into play in terms of the artificial intelligence side and being able to understand what's an anomaly that should be acted upon versus, hey, it's just high CPU utilization due to a process running and high memory utilization due to a process running, for example. And there are facts that you can look up in terms of when there are polymorphic infections out there and they're spreading, you can see all sorts of anomalies that are occurring either within the machine or with bandwidth utilization and so forth. So we're taking the collection of that information and acting on it real time to alert, to isolate, to quarantine and confine and protect.
So you're taking some proactive steps to isolate, especially backups. Mm-hmm. So one of the challenges we talked about earlier was when within seconds, your backups can be infected with a ransomware type issue as well. But with CloudDaddy's, what are you calling do you have a name for this service yet?
Advanced security.
Okay, with CloudDaddy Advanced Security, that's using this machine learning algorithm, you're taking some proactive steps to protect those backups from being infected. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So as we've been talking, there's literally a progression that you can see in terms of the technology and the habits in terms of managing a data center and managing infrastructure and protecting it that need to change. So in the past, what you did was you purchased antivirus, you potentially had another application that you used for examining ports and policy settings and security groups and things of the kind, and then going and dealing with the administration thereafter, right? And in addition to that, you no doubt had your backups being done and you still were taking your backup tapes or even hard drives and potentially other media and offloading them to some off-site location for protection, in terms of disaster recovery. What we're seeing is all of these aspects coming together more and more as the potential for ransomware threats and all sorts of malware out there and viruses continue to grow. And this year is supposed to be much worse than last year. And if the numbers from last year are any indication, there are billions of dollars that are being cost to organizations. Potentially, if you look at the lives that were lost in the UK and elsewhere in Europe when hospital systems were knocked out for weeks at a time. Potentially there were even lives lost as an end result of ransomware. You absolutely see the fact that administrators, CIOs are having issues with dealing with all three scenarios, from backup, disaster recovery, and advanced security in terms of protecting. And one of the issues with today's cybersecurity types of solutions out there is that they're all monitoring, they're all alerting, and for the greater part, none of them are actually taking action when they see something going wrong.
They're telling you instead.
They're telling you instead. But what happens is we notice that administrators either don't have the time or aren't looking at the specific time when an infection happens in order to be able to deal with it. So the infection continues and begins to spread, and the next thing you know, you're in trouble.
So that delay from administrators can cost them millions in the case of some cities we talked about, right. Because there's that latency introduces the potential for that issue to spread even further. So by taking some proactive steps, you're able to sort of nip it in the bud right away.
Yeah, there are no silver bullets in today's day and age, because where there's a will, there's a way. The technology continues to advance, and the bad guys out there, the threat actors, they continue to advance in terms of skill and technology as well. So they're always looking for backdoors and things of the kind. But what we propose doing is bringing the backup, disaster recovery, the data protection element together with advanced security and management of your infrastructure to provide more of a holistic solution in order to provide ultimately a pure data protection type of a solution to the customer.
And we're going to be talking about infrastructure management in a little while, and I think that's really important. That's really quite unique in bringing infrastructure management into the security paradigm, but it's something I think it's going to be more and more prevalent and important in the future. So I'm glad we'll be talking about that more. But that's what we have for our discussion around security and data protection right now, but there's more to come. And thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.